If you've been with us the last few weeks, we've been in Romans chapter 14 and 15, and we've been looking at this situation that's been going on in the church in Rome. There were these two different groups. You had the Jewish believers in Jesus, and you had the Gentile believers in Jesus in this church, and there was division. These two different groups differed in their practice. So the Jewish believers were still practicing parts of the Old Testament law, no longer necessary with the coming of Jesus, but they were doing that, and the Gentiles weren't doing those things. And these differences in practice went deep into their very identity and how these groups saw themselves. And so as we've said, as we've been going through these texts, the Jewish believers probably would have said something like, we're the ones who are really devoted to God, unlike them. And the Gentile believers probably would have said something like, we're the ones that really get the gospel and Jesus and freedom, unlike them. And while, yes, Paul says the Gentile believers are correct in what they've understood about the gospel, they didn't need to practice the food laws or observe certain days, yet the freedom that they had wasn't freedom to tear down, but to build up. And again, what we've seen is Paul has sought to help these two very different groups come together in and through Jesus. Because we've been saying that it's in Jesus that real community across difference is actually possible. If you look at our text this morning, verse 7 is really the main command. This is the direction that the passage last week, when we looked at really verses 1 through 6, this is the direction it was going, verse 7. And then the rest of the text, 8 through 13, is further supporting the command in verse 7, this command that we read, therefore, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. And we see again right there what we've been saying, that it's Jesus that makes the difference. Welcome one another. Jewish believer, welcome your Gentile brother. Gentile believer, welcome your Jewish brother, just as Jesus has welcomed you. This in many ways is summing up what Paul has been driving at throughout this section. But this morning, what I'd like to do is to focus on how Paul seeks to help the Jews and the Gentiles in the Roman church do this. What does Paul see as the thing that they really need? How does he help them in these different places to welcome each other? What does he think they need to be able to do this? I think there's two things that we see in this text. The first is hope. And if you were with us last week, we spent some time thinking about this. Verse 3 of this text quotes Psalm 69. And one of the things that we focused on last week was this was how Jesus was strong. That it was through hope that Jesus was able to do what he did, willingly choose the path of suffering, of not pleasing himself, but rather doing what would be necessary for us to be restored to God. But hope, we come back to again in verse 13 of this text, where we read, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. We need hope. But the other thing that we need, which Paul mentions in verse 4 of this text, and which he references again and again in verses 8 through 12, is the Scriptures. In fact, it's by the Scriptures that we grow in hope. Look at verse 4, where Paul writes this, for whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So let's consider these two this morning, Scriptures and hope, or as I have it in the sermon title, hearing the harmony of God's story and growing in hope. So first, hearing the harmony of God's story. If you've been around Trinity for any period of time, you know that I am a lover of jazz music, and I feel like it's been a couple sermons, and so we are just ripe for another jazz illustration. So jazz music is music of improvisation. And when a jazz musician plays a solo, when they improvise, one of the ways you could try to put into words what they are doing is they are telling a story. A really masterful jazz musician, what they are doing is the farthest thing possible from just playing a bunch of random notes. Through their note choices, rhythmic choices, tensions, they are developing themes. Chorus after chorus, they are taking the listener along. They are telling a story. This week, I was trying to think about what examples I would use because there are just countless, and I probably can only tell you one or two, and then I need to move on, but it's never wrong to mention Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, arguably one of the greatest jazz albums ever recorded. If you've never listened to it, I beg you, please go listen. Listen to the track Freddie Freeloader and Wynton Kelly's just masterful piano solo. Because what he is doing is this very thing. If you listen, you will hear him hit certain notes, and then he'll kind of hit them again, and he'll kind of come back to them, and he'll embellish, and he'll change it a little bit. He's telling a story, but like any good story, it's not bland. It's not overly predictable, but it's nuanced. It's playful. It's surprising. It's really satisfying. Listen to Wynton Kelly, perhaps my second example, with one of my favorite guitar players, Wes Montgomery, on the album Smokin' at the Half Note, which is just a super cool album name anyways. And you will hear these two and the harmonies and the melodies and the way they're playing off each other, and they're telling a story. For me, unlike any other music, perhaps because of this narrative aspect, jazz just sort of draws you out as you listen. It draws you as you're hearing these melodies and these harmonies and this story that's going on. And if you're listening to the scriptures well, it's meant to draw you out, to hear the harmonies and the beautiful notes of God's story. As Paul puts it in this text in verse 8 and 9, if we're hearing the notes and the harmonies of the story rightly, we hear the story of God's amazing faithfulness and his mercy in Jesus. That's the story the Bible is telling. And it really matters how we hear the Bible if we're going to hear the story rightly. So you may be here and all of this is completely new to you, like this is your first time in a church, or this is your first time really sitting with the Bible for any extended period of time and the good news of Jesus, and if that's you, that's awesome. We're so glad that you're here. But many of us in this room, we come with some kind of background in the church. Some of us maybe came from a background, or we grew up in a background where the Bible was talked about, the Bible was respected, but we never really got into the Bible. We never spent much time digging into it and reading into it. You didn't dig into the jungle of the Bible and the complexities and the themes and all the stuff going on and seeing how it's pointing to Jesus. And it's really possible to spend your whole life connected to some kind of church or Christian tradition, and you never really get into the Bible, and you don't know the story. Some of us come from a background where it seemed like the Bible was taken really seriously, but it was basically about us. That the Bible was thoroughly gleaned, and you were presented with a long list of things that you were not supposed to do and things that you were supposed to do. But that's very different from what we're talking about here. Right? If we have any doubt that there is a right way and a wrong way to read the Bible, that it's actually possible to fundamentally mishear the Bible, we only have to hear the words of Jesus when he is speaking to religious leaders in John chapter 5, and he says to them, "You search the scriptures. You're diligent. You search the scriptures because you think in them is life, but it is they that testify about me. Do you see what Paul is doing? The Bible is the story of God's faithfulness and mercy through Jesus. Look again at verses 8 and 9, where Paul writes, "For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy." This is how we are to take in the scriptures and hear them. It is this story of God's amazing faithfulness to his promises. Verse 8, Christ became a servant to the circumcised, that is the Jewish people, to Israel, for the sake of God's truthfulness. Because God is a God who has been making promises. If we go back to the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, when Adam and Eve turn away and sin against God, God makes a promise to save. When humanity seeks to make our own way back to God in the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, God frustrates and judges that completely misguided plan. And the very next chapter, chapter 12, God brings one man, one family to himself, Abraham, and he makes promises. He makes promises that he will be with him, that he will be Abraham's God, that he's going to bless Abraham, and that through Abraham, through this family, he's going to bless the whole world. The story of the Bible is a story of a God who freely chooses to bind himself to his people, making promises, who's faithful and true to all of his promises, even when his people turn and sin and fail, because God will fulfill his promises. He will bless Israel. He will reach the nations. And this is why Jesus came into the world, why he lived, why he went to a cross and died, why he rose again, so that God could be true to everything that he had promised, so that he could be faithful and he could be merciful. And what Paul goes on to do in these following verses 9 through 12, is to really recall some of the musical notes of God's story, to make his point, and in a sense, keep asking, did you hear that? Were you listening to this story? As Paul has been at pains throughout Romans to show God's faithfulness and his mercy, Gentile believers, don't forget that your story, your connection to God is through the people of Israel. Jesus is Israel's Messiah. Jewish believers, don't forget that God's intention to bless you and fulfill his promises was always for the sake of the nations. Look at verse 9. Paul quoting from Psalm 18, as it is written, "Therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles and sing to your name." As Jeff already mentioned, Psalm 18, this was our call to worship text, is a psalm of David, celebrating when God delivered David from his enemies. But Paul sees, and the scriptures really see, the Psalms, while true of David and the different historical things that were going on, they were always pointing forward. They were pointing to this greater experience of salvation and victory when God would raise up his Messiah, his King, who would rule the world, and the nations would be drawn to him. And this is what we see in this quotation. The next is from the end of Deuteronomy 32. And in this, Moses is telling what is going to happen, that Israel is going to fail. They're going to break covenant. They're going to go into exile. But God is going to bring them back, and he's going to bring the Gentiles too. And together, they're going to praise him for his faithfulness and mercy. Romans 15:10. And again it is said, "Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people." In verse 11 of the text, Paul quotes from Psalm 117, a very, very short psalm, which is pretty much exactly about what he's saying here. It's about God's faithfulness and his mercy and his worldwide purpose to save. And again, praise the Lord, all you Gentiles, let all the peoples extol him. And then finally, verse 12, Paul quotes from Isaiah 11, a prophecy about Israel's Messiah, their promised king. Verse 12 of Romans, And again, Isaiah says, the root of Jesse will come, even he who arises to rule the Gentiles. In him will the Gentiles hope. Are you guys hearing the themes? This is the story. And if you were a Jewish believer receiving this letter, or perhaps a Gentile believer well-versed in the Hebrew Scriptures, this is a bit of a mic drop moment for Paul, because he just quoted from all three main sections of the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament: the law, the prophets, and the writings, or sometimes referred to as the Psalms. He's just referred to the whole story, and he's basically said, were we listening? Like, it was there, it was there, it was there. This is what God has been doing. And this is how he began the book of Romans. It's like Paul is developing his own jazz solo. I'm just going to keep taking the jazz thing further and further. He's taking what he talked about in Romans 1 through 4, that the gospel promised in the scriptures of the Old Testament about God's Son, who descended from David, who was raised, who is ruling the world, through whom Jew and Gentile are coming to be saved and know God. Here's why this matters. When you hear the story this way, when you hear it the way Paul's laying it out, when these themes of God's faithfulness and his mercy are what you understand this story to be about, it draws you to hope. Hearing the harmony of God's story leads to hope. Why? Well, one of the reasons is hearing the scriptures like we've been talking about. It causes us to hope because it situates our lives and our stories in this much bigger, grander story of God's redemption through Jesus. It helps us to see our own lives in the bigger story of God's faithfulness and his grace, and it gives our lives meaning and purpose and direction. Just this past week, I was listening to a podcast from English L'Abri. If you're not familiar with L'Abri, it's a Christian ministry that provides a place for people to discuss religion and philosophical beliefs and explore questions about God. This episode was titled, "The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God." And it's not in any way like a triumphalistic take on what's happening in the world with belief in God. The guest speaker, Justin Bierley, who wrote a book with this very title, acknowledges all the de-churching phenomenon and that kind of stuff. Yet one of the things that he points out is that in his long experience of interacting with atheists and agnostics, the tone of the conversation has changed. So, if you're around my age or older, you probably remember some of the militant atheists of the 2000s. So this, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. And books like The God Delusion that Dawkins wrote weren't just straightforward philosophical arguments for why you shouldn't believe in God. They were aggressively against belief in God. They were trying to convert people, basically, to atheism. And one of the changes that has happened in the last 2 decades or so, since the mid-2000s, is there has been a number of intellectuals, scholars, historians, and philosophers that are pointing out that the atheistic story, that there is no God, that we all just got here through chance and evolution, that it really fails to account for the world we actually live in. It doesn't fit. The story doesn't fit parts of reality that we just intuit and sense to be true. We've referenced up here many times the work of historian Tom Holland, for example. But he's one person who has shown that so many of the values that we hold in our society, like mercy, love, forgiveness, the fact that modern people just outright say slavery, evil, wrong. Everybody is equal. All human life is equally valuable. These values, they don't come from the ancient world. They don't come from the Romans. They don't come from the Greeks. They don't come from the Enlightenment. They come from Christianity. And Tom Holland, who I believe would still call himself an agnostic, although it appears like even he is in some ways moving toward belief, he acknowledges that so many of the things that he believes and values, they come from the Christian story, and they really only make sense in that story. In the podcast, one specific person that was mentioned is this woman named Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was born in Somalia. She's an ex-Muslim. She was part of an extreme radical Muslim cult called the Muslim Brotherhood. She escaped to the Netherlands and became a prominent atheist. And I did not really know that much about her. I wasn't so familiar with her, but she was kind of like right up there with those four guys I mentioned, Dawkins and Hitchens and the rest. She shared stages with those guys. She wrote her own anti-religion book called Infidel. But a year ago, November 2023, she published this article, Why I Am Now a Christian. And in the article, she mentions a number of things that led to this change in her life. She mentions the work of Tom Holland, for example. She writes about the global problems and the need to return to Christian roots that have produced so many of the institutions and values of modern society, like democracy and freedom and mercy and humility. But she also talks about the personal need she felt. She writes this: I have also turned to Christianity because I ultimately found life without any spiritual solace unendurable, indeed very nearly self-destructive. Atheism failed to answer a simple question: what is the meaning and purpose of life? She goes on to write about how when she was a Muslim, she saw the power of a unifying story to draw people in, but that in Christianity, she's found a better story than that in Islam, better story than that in atheism. Another reason why the Christian story causes us to hope if we listen to it, and Jeff mentioned this earlier as well, is because it's not about us. And that is really freeing. If our lives and our stories are ultimately about us and up to us, then if we can even speak of hope, it is an incredibly fragile hope. It all rests on what we can achieve and what we can control. And so any failure, any suffering, any tragedy can steal the hope, can smash the hope, can take it away and destroy it forever. If our stories are about us and what we can do, our hope will be fragile, our lives will be stressed, our posture will be one of anxiety. Here's a story that not only makes sense of so much of what we just intuit to be good and true and beautiful, but the Christian story also lifts the weight off of us because our lives are carried in this larger story of God's grace and His love and His faithfulness. And one final reason, I'll just mention that the story of the Bible and God's faithfulness and His grace and mercy through Jesus, it grows us in hope when we take it in. It's because God Himself is speaking to us. Look at verse 13 again. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. God is at work by His Spirit. This story isn't just satisfying a need to make sense of things. It's not just a convenient way to take off the pressure. It's supernatural. The God who spoke all things into existence speaks in His Word. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we want to do this. Like, we want to unpack the Bible, and we want to think about it, whether it's Sunday morning or in Sunday school or in discipleship groups or in other contexts in our church or Bible studies, things that you all do. We want to take in the Word because God speaks to us. This is why these weird things can happen where we come into church and maybe we didn't even believe, and then we leave and we find ourselves trusting in Jesus. Or we come in just burdened and weighed down, and we leave with a sense of lightness. Because this book isn't dead, and it's not lifeless. Its author is speaking to you. Many of you know that before I came to Trinity, I worked with college students in this ministry called Reform University Fellowship. And I was out east at the University of Delaware. And part of our ministry, 2 times a year, we would do these equipping retreats, which were different from like our normal sort of like, hey, let's hang out and we'll have a speaker come in and we'll do a retreat. These were like intense retreats. We would arrive on a Friday night, and from Friday all day Saturday and a little bit Sunday morning before we all went to a church together, we would spend like 10 to 12 hours studying the Bible. We would teach students how to interpret the Bible. We did this Bible survey. We did systematic theology. And I remember one of the times that I was leading Bible survey, there was a student from our campus who came on the retreat, and she was going through just a really hard time in her life. She was struggling. She was overwhelmed. There were problems at home. There were problems in school. And I think she would have said, I feel depressed. I think I'm depressed. She just felt crippled by life and the pressures weighing on her. And then she came on this retreat, and we just read the Bible. I mean, like we started in Genesis. We didn't read the whole thing, but we started in Genesis, and we read a lot of the Bible. And we looked at these themes in even more depth than we have this morning. And we went from Genesis to Revelation. And I remember meeting up with her for coffee like a day after the retreat. And you could just see in her face there was this lightness and this joy and this peace. And it was like she became a new person because her life was set in the context of God's faithfulness and his mercy and his love. I want you to imagine you're a student. Some of you don't have to imagine, you are a student. You know, you're in high school, or you're a college student, or you're a grad student, and you just feel stressed out, and you wonder what the future holds, and it's kind of crippling sometimes, and you kind of need everything to work a certain way, at least in your mind, and you just feel overwhelmed. You don't know what's coming. Or imagine that you're a parent with kids, and you're exhausted, and you wonder, like, am I doing enough? And am I doing a good job? And sometimes you just feel like a failure. Or imagine that you're someone who is here this morning and you just feel like you have pretty much messed up your life. And no matter what you do, you will not be able to fix it. Or imagine you're a Jewish believer or a Gentile believer in this little tiny church in Rome, 2,000 years ago, and you're just really annoyed with that other group. And you struggle to welcome them as God calls you to. What do you need? You need this story. You need a story of God's faithfulness and his mercy to lead you to hope, to give you meaning and purpose and direction and the strength to have the weight taken off, to know what world and story you're living in, to be strengthened by God's Spirit supernaturally, to live into this story. This is the story that we need to reframe our life, our identity, our struggles, our failures, to be drawn up into the wonder and joy of Jesus, who has loved us, who has shown us mercy, who has welcomed us. And so let me invite us now to turn to a time of prayer. Every week after we hear God speak to us, we turn and we speak to him. We acknowledge and confess those things in our lives, those places, instances where we have not trusted him, where we've not lived out of his love, where we've not loved others. We come to God confessing, asking for his help, and he calls us to do this that he might forgive us, give us grace, help us in and through Jesus. So let's spend a few moments in prayer, a silent prayer, and then I will close us in a moment.